Kesubos Daf Memches contains one Mishnah, which divides the daf in half. The first half of the daf before the Mishnah is finishing up the commentary on the last Mishnah, discussing primarily the husband's obligation to provide his wife with a funeral. The Gemara will discuss what level he has to provide for her and explain the Mishnah on it. The Gemara will give a halachic ruling, and then the Gemara will give another halacha said by the same person, which will take us into a discussion of what happens when a husband leaves, what will the Beis Din do with his property, and to what purposes will they disperse it. Well, before all that, the Gemara begins by concluding its last discussion about what the word shara means, when we said that there are three obligations that a man has to his wife. She'er, ksus, va'ona. We talked about shara. So Gemara says shara refers to the physical relationship, the skin-to-skin contact between a husband and his wife during intimacy. The Gemara says that has to be provided. It's an obligation. It's forbidden for him to say he wants to do like the Persians do, that they do marital intimacy with clothing on. The Gemara says Rav Huna said, and this supports Rav Huna. Rav Huna said that somebody who says, I only intend to fulfill that obligation while I'm dressed and she is dressed, that's considered a violation of her rights, and therefore he is obligated to divorce her and has to pay her ksuba. All right, now the Gemara goes to the obligation that husband has to provide his wife with a funeral if she dies, obviously. So the Gemara has seen in the Mishnah that the Tanna Kama says he's obligated to give her a funeral, and Rabbi Yehuda said the poorest in Yisrael has to give 2 flutes and a lamenter, a eulogizer of sorts. So the Gemara says it seems that there's a machlokas here between Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanna Kama whether he has to give that or not. So the Gemara says, how could there be a machlokas about that? She should be obligated to provide her with the standard. Whatever her normal standard is, that's what he's obligated to give her. What exactly is this discussion about? So the Gemara says the discussion is about a situation where it's his standard to provide that much, but not her standard. His family, the circles in which he moves has that amount, has that level of a funeral. In her circles, they don't have. Now, we know that the halacha generally is when a husband and wife get married, he has to provide for her the higher of their two social levels. If he was higher than her, he has to bring her up to his level, and if she was higher, he has to continue to support her on the level that she's used to. And the question is, that is true for things that she's used to during her lifetime. After she dies, is the same hold true for her funeral? And that's what this machlokes is. According to Rabbi Yehuda, yes, even after the death, he still has to provide her that level. If that is what he was used to in his household, he has to provide that for his wife. He has to bring her up to his level. According to the Chachamim, no, it was only things during her lifetime that has to provide that, but not something after the death. Now, what's the halacha? The Gemara says Rav Chizda says the name of Mar Ukva. The halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. Once we quoted that, so the Gemara quotes another similar related halacha said by Rav Chizda, the name of Mar Ukva, and that's talking about somebody who becomes insane and therefore he loses his faculties. He is no longer able to take care of his estate. So the Beis Din have to take control of his property in order to be able to provide support to his wife. So the Gemara says that the Beis Din will use the money to provide support to his wife, to his sons, and to his daughters, and for davar acher, for something else. The Gemara will discuss what something else is in a few minutes. This is the halacha. The Gemara says when the guy is around, but he loses his faculties. So Gemara asks that seems to contradict the Brisa that says that if he went to Medina Siyam, meaning he traveled away, then we take control of his property. We provide support with it to his wife, but not to his children, and not for davar acher. So that's contradictory. So why the difference? So the Gemara says the difference is very simple. When he voluntarily left, he picked himself up and he left, he could have provided for his children. He obviously didn't want to. Now, a man is not obligated to provide for his adult children. There's no obligation on him. It's common, but he's not obligated to. So had he wanted to, he would have done it himself. The fact that he didn't do it himself means we won't do that with his property. However, for his wife, he's obligated to, so we will. Okay, so the guy went crazy. So there, he didn't make any decisions. So we'll assume that, like most people do, he wanted to provide for his children as well. The Gemara now asks, what is davar acher? What is this other thing? So Gemara quotes 2 opinions. Rav Chizda says it is perfume for his wife, and Rav Yosef said it is his charitable obligations as a member of the community. So as we were at a Mishnah, we had said that if he lost his faculties, we are not going to provide these things. So Gemara says, according to the opinion that says that it is perfume for his wife. If he's not providing that, certainly we assume that he didn't want to provide a charity. However, according to the opinion, it says we didn't want to provide a charity. He would say that perfume for his wife he did want to provide. A person is very careful with the honor of his wife, and certainly he would have wanted her to have the proper perfume. Now, the Gemara discusses a third case, and that is where a man went to Medina Siyam, and while he's away, his wife died, and the Beis Din now has to take possession of his property in order to fund the funeral. So the Gemara, the quote we have of Rav Chibar Avin in the name of Rav Huna, said that we finance the funeral in accordance with his honor, on his social level. So the Gemara asks on his and not on hers. The Gemara says no, on hers also. We mean to say either his or hers, whichever is higher, because that's always the rule, even after Misa. I like the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda earlier, that we go with the higher of the two. Now the Gemara quotes the statement of Rav Masna. If somebody who's on his own deathbed and he said, don't use my property to bury my wife, we do listen to him. We follow that instructions. So Gemara asks, why would we listen to him? You mean to say that he has the right to decide that, but the understanding would be that after he dies, the property is going to fall as an inheritance to his children, and if his children aren't obligated to pay for the funeral, so then we would never use his property to pay for the funeral. What does that have to do with the fact that he said not to? It's not up to him. He doesn't own it. So whether he said or he didn't say, the halacha should be the same. The property belongs to his kids. It's up to them. So Gemara therefore changes the case. Gemara says it's not that he said, don't use my property to bury my wife. He said, don't use my property to bury myself. And what he, in a sense, was doing was he was taking the financial obligation to bury himself off his children, and he was putting it on the tzibur, because if his kids aren't obligated to do it, and his estate is not going to do it, then it becomes a meis mitzvah, and everybody else has to deal with it. So the Gemara says he doesn't have the right to save his kids money by taking his obligation, the obligation for his burial, off their shoulders and putting it on the klal. You cannot throw yourself on the klal in that manner. Now we get to the Mishnah. The Mishnah is going to discuss when exactly a woman transfers from her father's rishos to her husband's rishos. The Mishnah says there's a moment of transfer from the father's rishos to the husband's rishos, and that is when she enters the chuppah. As long as she's only mikudeshes, she's still considered to be part of her father's rishos, and if she's a bas Yisrael and she's married a Kohen, she still can't eat truma yet. From the moment of chuppah, whether it's the chuppah or the house, whatever functions as the chuppah, she's now in the husband's rishos. Now, what if he had shluchim? So as long as the father or his shluchim were bringing her to the husband, it's still in the father's rishos. If they meet the husband's messengers along the way, so if the father or the messengers of the father give the girl over to the messengers of the husband, that's a moment of transfer. Now she's in the husband's rishos. Unless they continue walking along with her towards the place where the husband is, then she's still in the father's rishos, not yet transferred to the husband's rishos. The Gemara now begins. First order is always to clear up linguistic issues. The Mishnah had said la'olam, forever. She is always in the father's rishos until she's transferred. The Gemara says, what's that extra word forever for? The Gemara says this is to disagree with the opinion of the first Mishnah in Perek Afalpi that says that if they set a time for the wedding and the husband defaults and he doesn't do the wedding on time, she transfers to his responsibility anyway. And this Mishnah is teaching us that that's not true. Even if he didn't meet the date as he was obligated to, she still doesn't transfer to his rishos until they actually do chuppah. The Gemara now questions the concept of giving her over to the shluchim, to the messengers of the husband. That's not a chuppah. How does that make her in his rishos? Chuppah, you require chuppah for the marriage to exist. She's not married to him. She's just with his messengers on the way over to him. Concerning what is she not considered to be in his rishos and his responsibility? So the Gemara brings four opinions here. The Gemara's first opinion is Rav. Rav says it's as far as eating truma. She is now allowed to eat truma. She is allowed to do everything except for truma. Truma is one thing that she's not allowed to do. All other rights are given over. Truma she can't because we're still afraid the marriage may end up being canceled when the husband sees her. Ravasi says for truma as well, because the only reason that an arusa is not allowed to eat truma is because she may give her family who are Yisraelim, but she is no longer with her family, and therefore she can't give them. Gemara has a kasha on Rav Asi from our Mishnah, which says she's always in the father's rishos until chuppah, and we said that that's to go against the Mishnah in Afal Pi that said that she can eat truma if he misses the date. So you see that our Mishnah is disagreeing and saying that truma she cannot eat. So Gemara says, no, it's not a problem. It's talking about chuppah. Our Mishnah is going to say until she has chuppah, she can't eat truma. Missing the date doesn't count. You need to have chuppah, but giving over to the shliach counts as chuppah. That'll fit in our Mishnah. That's not an issue. Then Gemara brings two more opinions as to what sense she transfers to the sister of the husband. Shmuel says that the husband now inherits her property that she brings into the marriage. Any nadan, any nedunya that she brings in, property that she brings in, is now considered to be his if she dies at this point, even though she's only an arusa, and an arusa usually is not inherited by her husband. Since she's already been given over to his messengers, the father gives Gemir Stas that the property belongs to her and therefore to him. Rish Lakish says it's for her ksuba. Now, ksuba usually means the property that's spelled out in the ksuba that she's bringing into the marriage. So Gemara says that's the same as Shmuel. Gemara says she doesn't. When we say ksuba here, we don't mean the property that's enumerated in the ksuba. We mean the fact that from henceforth she will only get the ksuba of an almana. If her husband were to die at this point, she would be considered an almana and she wouldn't be able to get a ksuba of masayim. Now, Rav Yochanan and Rav Chanina, they say, according in all halachos, it counts as a transfer in all halachos for when she's given over to the shulchan of the av. Everything she's considered to be on his responsibility. Gemara now asks, we have a brisa that clearly says like Shmuel. Brisa says that if there's any transfer which is not a valid transfer, such as, for example, if the husband walks along with her, along with the shluchim of the av, or his messengers walk along the shluchim of the av, even if they stop, she's traveling with the husband himself, and they stop in an inn, but only to spend the night, not to be together, not to consummate the marriage. All these things is not a transfer, so then she still is in her husband, is in her father's rishos. Even if her husband's holding on to her ksuba, the father still owns any property that she has as part of that nadin, and if she dies at that point, the father takes her inheritance. If, however, the father turned back, or the messengers of the father turn back, or they go into an inn along the way and do nesuin there, now she's in the husband's rishos, and even if the father's holding the ksuba with the list, the husband will inherit her. So this brisa clearly talks about inheritance only. It doesn't talk about other things like truma. So it clearly shows the moment of transfer of shluchim is only le'inyan inheritance, not in anything else. And Gemara says this is a tiyufta, it's a final kasha on everybody except for Shmuel. Now, the Gemara asks, there's a contradiction in the brisa itself. We said that if they stopped in an inn to rest, then it's not considered to be transferred into his rishos, and they stopped in an inn to do nesuin, they are. What if they stopped without any stated person? They didn't say what they're stopping for. They just stopped. What's the stomach? The first half seems to indicate that if they didn't specify, it's considered nesuin. The second half seems to indicate that if they didn't specify, it's just to rest. Which is it? So the Gemara says, both stomachs exist. It depends who owns the inn and where they stopped, and it's not referring to an inn along the way, it's referring to where they stopped in a chutzner. They stopped in property that belongs to one of them. So if they stopped in her property, it's assumed to be not nesuin, unless they specifically said we're going in here for nesuin. If it was his property, it's assumed that it is nesuin, unless they said specifically they were going in here just to sleep and were not having nesuin now. Now the Gemara asks, what about the inyan of znus? What if she's mezana? That means the father transferred her to the messengers of the husband, and then she's mezana. Is she considered to be an arusa or an asua? An arusa gets skila, an asua gets chenek. So the Gemara brings a brayso that says she gets chenek. So Gemara says, how do you know? So Gemara quotes the pasuk discussing the parsha of the znus of Einar Hamarasa, and over there it says Liznos Beis Avia, extra phrase. Novella ki asas novella bisel Liznos Beis Avia, extra phrase is to include even a situation is to limit, that is, to limit to a situation where she's Beis Avia. But she was given over to Shluchei Habal, there, even though she's still an Arusa, she doesn't count as Beis Avia, and she's therefore excluded from the Parsha of Nara Marasa, and therefore she doesn't get skila like it says there. She goes to the halachos of a regular married woman, that's Mizana, which is Chenek. So Gemara asks, how do you know that's what's being excluded? How do you know that it's excluding a case where she was given over to the shluchim of the husband, so she's not beveis aviyah? Maybe it's to exclude where she did chuppah, but she didn't do biyah yet. So that's what's being added by this phrase as being called no longer beveis aviyah. Gemara says, no, you don't need a pasuk for that. Rava says that Ami said to me, chuppah says straight out. It says that this parsha applies to a nara psula ma'orasa. Nar means nar, not a bogeres. Basula means not a beula. What does marasa mean? Marasa means and not married. But we just said that she can't be a beula. So it's got to be referring to exclude someone who is a nisua, but is still a beula. So that is from that pasuk. So that can't be learned out of the phrase Liznos Beisavia. Liznos Beisavia has to be referring to somebody else who is no longer considered to be a Beisavia, not a nisua who didn't do bia yet. So it's got to be referring to this situation where she was given over to Shluchei Ha'av, but she herself did not do chuppah. And that's going to be the source. Now, the Gemara has more questions on the topic, which we'll get to in the next daf.